They called him the Ghost of Cygnus Data, not in a way that inspired awe or fear, but in a way that dismissed him, erased him. He was Elias Thorne, the night janitor, a man whose presence was only noted by the scent of lemon-scented cleaner in the morning and the pristine, trackless gleam of the marble floors. He was a fixture, as much a part of the building as the humming server racks and the tinted glass windows that looked out over the sprawling city. To the bright young minds of the tech giant, the ambitious coders and ruthless project managers, he was invisible. A relic from a bygone era, with tired eyes that had seen too much and a slight, almost imperceptible limp he carried with quiet dignity. And to no one was he more invisible, more utterly beneath notice, than Kalen Vance. Kalen was the director of operations, a man carved from arrogance and tailored in expensive silk. He moved through the world as if he owned it, his voice a sharp instrument he used to dissect the confidence of his subordinates. Today, that instrument was aimed squarely at the figure standing in the doorway of the primary server hub. The air thrummed with a discordant symphony of alarms, a high-pitched shriek of failing systems that scraped at the nerves. Red lights flashed across the faces of the panicked technicians, painting them in strokes of pure dread. Kalen's perfectly coiffed hair was slightly askew, a single bead of sweat tracing a path down his temple. His voice, however, retained its cutting edge. "What in the hell do you think you're doing here?" he snapped, his gaze falling upon Elias, who stood motionless, his gray janitorial uniform a stark contrast to the chaos. "This is a restricted area. Get your mop and bucket and get out, now." Elias didn't move. His eyes, usually downcast and weary, were now fixed on the central diagnostic monitor. The data scrolling across the screen was a waterfall of error codes, a language of disaster that was gibberish to most. But to him, it was as clear as a printed page. He saw the pattern, the cascading failure originating from a single, overlooked anomaly in the thermal regulation system. He saw the digital cliff that the entire company was about to plummet over. "Sir," Elias said, his voice quiet but carrying an unnatural weight that cut through the noise. "You need to initiate a full system bypass of the tertiary coolant pumps and reroute power through the auxiliary grid. Your current protocol is creating a feedback loop. In 90 seconds, the core temperature will reach critical mass. The entire array will flash boil. Everything will be gone." Kalen stared, his face a mask of incredulous fury. The janitor, the old man who cleaned his toilets, was presuming to give him orders. The sheer audacity was breathtaking. "Are you deaf? I said get out. Security!" he bellowed, pointing a trembling finger. "Get this fossil out of my server room." Two burly security guards started forward, their expressions apologetic but firm. They knew Elias. He was the guy who always asked about their kids, who left them a thermos of hot coffee during the graveyard shift. But an order was an order. As they reached for his arms, the main entrance to the operations floor slid open with a pneumatic hiss that was deafening in the sudden, tense silence. The alarms had stopped, not because the problem was fixed, but because the system had finally, irrevocably, given up. A dead, ominous hum replaced the shrieking. Through the doorway stepped three figures clad in tactical black, their movements fluid and economical. They wore no visible insignia, but they carried an aura of authority that made the corporate security guards look like frightened children. They were followed by a man in a crisp, decorated military uniform, a silver-haired general whose face was a roadmap of hard-won battles and impossible decisions. His eyes scanned the room, cold and analytical, before they landed on Elias. A flicker of recognition, a hint of profound respect. The general ignored Kalen completely, striding directly toward the janitor. He came to a halt a respectful 2 feet away. The 2 security guards froze, their hands hovering uselessly near Elias's shoulders. Kalen, his authority usurped, sputtered. "Who the hell are you? This is a private facility. I am the director of—" The general raised a single hand, a gesture that silenced Kalen more effectively than a shout. His gaze never left Elias. The leader of the tactical team stepped forward, a satellite phone in his hand. He looked at the general, who gave a minute nod. The man then turned his attention to Elias, his expression unreadable. "Ma'am?" "Oh, sorry. Sir," the operative corrected himself. A slip of protocol from a world Kalen couldn't begin to comprehend. The words hung in the air, charged with meaning. "We're here for the asset. Elias Thorne, your extraction team has arrived." Kalen's jaw fell slack. His mind, which moved so quickly when it came to stock options and market projections, ground to a halt. Extraction team? Asset? He looked from the stone-faced general to the silent, black-clad soldiers, and then to the old janitor. The ghost? The man he had humiliated, threatened, and dismissed countless times. And in the quiet, tired eyes of Elias Thorne, Kalen saw for the very first time, not a janitor, but the calm, terrifying certainty of a man who had been in far, far worse rooms than this one. The silence that followed was the sound of Kalen Vance's entire world beginning to shatter. He had made a mistake. A terrible, career-ending, life-altering mistake, and he was only just beginning to understand the magnitude of it. 3 months earlier, the world of Cygnus data ran on the smooth, predictable hum of commerce and code. From the outside, the gleaming chrome and glass tower was a monument to the digital age, a beacon of innovation that promised to revolutionize data security. Inside, it was a kingdom, and Kalen Vance was one of its princes. He strode through the lobby each morning at precisely 8:55 a.m., his Italian leather shoes clicking a rhythm of self-importance on the polished marble. His suits were flawless, his handshake firm, his smile a predatory baring of teeth that he reserved for investors and board members. For everyone else, there was a look of faint, weary disdain. Elias Thorne, meanwhile, moved through the same space in a different dimension of time. His day, or rather his night, began when the last of the ambitious employees departed, leaving behind the lingering scent of stale coffee and ambition. He would arrive at 10 p.m., trading a quiet nod with the overnight security guard before beginning his methodical ritual. He didn't just clean. He restored order. He moved with an economy of motion that was almost beautiful to watch, if anyone had ever bothered to watch. Each sweep of his mop was precise. Each wipe of a surface left no streaks. He treated his janitorial cart not as a collection of cleaning supplies, but as a mobile workstation. Every bottle had its place. Every cloth was folded to the same exact dimension. This particular night was like any other. Elias was on the 17th floor, the executive wing. He was buffing the floor outside Kalen Vance's corner office. The machine's low whir, a familiar companion in the silent building. The nameplate on the door read, Kalen Vance, Director of Operations. Elias had polished that brass plate hundreds of times. He knew the man only by the mess he left behind. Discarded printouts of market analyses, an empty cup from an overpriced coffee shop, the faint, cloying scent of his expensive cologne. The elevator chimed, a rare sound at 2 a.m. Elias paused his work, moving his cart discreetly into an alcove, a habit born of a desire to be unobtrusive. The doors slid open, and Kalen Vance stepped out, accompanied by a young woman Elias recognized as Maya, a junior programmer from the analytics department. She looked exhausted and deeply uncomfortable. Kalen, however, was energized, wired, his eyes gleaming with a manic intensity. "The Taipei launch is non-negotiable, Maya," Kalen was saying, his voice echoing in the empty corridor. "I don't care if your team has to recode the entire authentication sequence. My father didn't put me in this chair to listen to excuses. He put me here to deliver results. Do you understand?" "Yes, Mr. Vance," Maya murmured, her gaze fixed on the floor. "But the algorithm is unstable. Pushing it live could compromise the entire client database. It's a security risk." "Security is my department, not yours," Kalen sneered. "Your department is to write the code I tell you to write. Stop thinking and start typing." He stopped outside his office, fumbling for his key card. He seemed to notice Elias for the first time, a flicker of annoyance crossing his features. He didn't address him directly, but gestured vaguely in his direction while speaking to Maya. "See this? This is what happens when you don't have ambition. You end up polishing floors for a living, invisible. A ghost. Is that what you want?" Maya flinched, her face flushing with shame. She risked a quick, apologetic glance at Elias. Elias's expression remained unchanged. He simply stood by his cart, his hands resting on the handle, his posture one of patient waiting. He had heard worse. Far worse. The words were meaningless pebbles thrown against a fortress wall. He had learned long ago that a man's worth was not determined by the judgment of lesser men. Kalen finally found his card and swiped it, the lock beeping green. He pushed the door open and flicked on the lights. "I want a full progress report on my desk by 6 a.m. Not 6:01. 6. Go." Maya practically fled toward the elevator, her shoulders slumped in defeat. Kalen watched her go with a smirk, then turned to enter his office, nearly tripping over the corner of Elias's industrial buffer. He stumbled, catching himself on the doorframe. His face, which had been smug, twisted into a mask of rage. He whirled on Elias. "Watch where you leave your junk, old man." He spat, his voice low and venomous. "This is a multi-billion-dollar corporation, not a bingo hall. This equipment is an eyesore. Keep it out of my sight." "Understood, sir," Elias said, his voice a low, even rumble. He made no move to apologize, only to acknowledge the command. His calmness seemed to infuriate Kalen even more. "Do you understand?" Kalen stepped closer, invading Elias's personal space. He was a good foot taller than the janitor, a fact he used to his full advantage, looming over him. "When I walk these halls, I don't want to see you. I don't want to see your cart. I don't want to smell your cheap cleaning chemicals. You are a necessary evil, but you will be an invisible one. Am I making myself clear?" "Perfectly, sir," Elias replied, his eyes meeting Kalen's for a brief second. There was no fear in his gaze, no anger. There was only a profound, bottomless weariness, and something else. Something hard and ancient, like bedrock beneath a layer of soil. Kalen, expecting deference or fear, was taken aback by the sheer neutrality of the response. It was like shouting at a mountain. He felt an irrational surge of anger at being denied the satisfaction of intimidating the old man. He scoffed, a sharp, ugly sound. "Just do your job and stay out of the way of people who are actually important," he said, before turning on his heel and slamming his office door shut. The sound echoed down the empty hall like a gunshot. Elias stood motionless for a long moment. He let out a slow, controlled breath, a technique he had mastered decades ago in places where a single, uncontrolled gasp could mean death. He reached into the pocket of his worn trousers, his fingers closing around a small metallic object. It was a coin, heavy and smooth, its silver surface tarnished with age and constant touch. He rubbed his thumb over the faint, worn-down relief of an eagle on one side and a shield on the other. It was his anchor, a reminder of a different life, a different man. He looked at the polished floor, at the reflection of the fluorescent lights stretching out like sterile white bars. Caylen Vance was a bully, a petty tyrant in a kingdom of glass and light. Elias had faced down warlords in dusty, sun-scorched countries and stared into the cold eyes of ideologues who would burn the world to see their vision realized. Caylen Vance was nothing, a loud, spoiled child. And yet, this was the peace he had chosen: anonymity, the quiet, thankless work of restoring order in the dark, unnoticed hours. He was a ghost, and that was exactly what he wanted to be. Because ghosts had no past, no future. They just were. And for a man who had spent a lifetime making decisions that weighed on the fate of nations, the simple, uncomplicated reality of a clean floor was a kind of salvation. He released the coin, letting it settle back into his pocket, and resumed his work. The buffer whirred back to life, its steady hum a quiet act of defiance, erasing Caylen's footsteps from the floor as if he had never been there at all. The incident in the hallway set a new, colder tone. Caylen Vance, having failed to elicit the fear he craved, now seemed to make it his personal mission to torment Elias. The humiliations became a regular feature of life at Cygnus Data, small acts of cruelty that served to reinforce Caylen's dominance in his own mind. He would accidentally spill his coffee on a freshly mopped floor, and then watch with a smirk as Elias cleaned it up. He would leave passive-aggressive notes complaining about a chemical smell or a smudge on the glass of his office window, which overlooked a sheer 50-story drop on the outside. Elias absorbed it all with the same stoic patience. He never complained. He never reacted. He simply did the work. His impassivity was a mirror that reflected Caylen's ugliness back at him, and it drove the director of operations into fits of quiet, simmering rage. He couldn't understand why the old janitor wouldn't break. The first major confrontation, the one that everyone would remember, happened a month later in the bustling company cafeteria during the lunch rush. It was a calculated act of public shaming. Elias was making his rounds, emptying trash receptacles. The cafeteria was packed, a cacophony of conversations and clattering trays. Caylen was holding court at a large table with several of his senior managers and a few intimidated junior employees, including Maya. As Elias approached their table, Caylen deliberately stuck his foot out. It was a clumsy, obvious trip, a schoolyard bully's tactic. Elias, despite his limp, moved with a surprising, ingrained sense of balance. He stumbled but didn't fall, catching himself on the edge of the table. A few trays clattered, but nothing spilled. Caylen, however, acted as if a catastrophe had occurred. He shot to his feet, his face a mask of theatrical fury. "My God, can you not even walk a straight line?" he boomed, his voice silencing the nearby conversations. People turned to look. "You nearly sent my laptop flying. This is a $2,000 machine. Do you have any idea how much you make in a year? You couldn't afford to replace the power cord on this thing." The table of managers chuckled sycophantically. Maya sank lower in her seat, her face burning with second-hand embarrassment. Elias straightened up slowly. He looked at Caylen's outstretched foot, then back at his face. "My apologies, sir," he said, his voice flat. "It won't happen again." "It won't happen again?" Caylen mocked, pitching his voice high. "You're a walking hazard. An insurance liability. Look at you. You're ancient. Maybe it's time we put you out to pasture. This is a dynamic, fast-paced environment. We can't have decrepit old men shuffling around, causing accidents. The word decrepit hung in the air, thick and ugly. Elias's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. His hand drifted to his pocket, his fingers finding the familiar, cool metal of the silver coin. He squeezed it, the sharp edge of the worn-down shield digging into his thumb. It was a small, private act of anchoring himself against the storm of humiliation. "I am capable of performing my duties, sir," Elias stated, not as a plea, but as a simple declaration of fact. "Are you?" Kalen challenged, a cruel smile playing on his lips. He picked up his half-eaten salad and, with a flick of his wrist, upended it onto the floor. A mess of lettuce, tomatoes, and oily vinaigrette splattered across the white linoleum. "Your duties include keeping this place clean, do they not?" "Well, look, there's a mess. Clean it up." A collective gasp went through the onlookers. This was no longer just arrogance. It was naked cruelty. Even Kalen's own managers looked uncomfortable. Kalen pointed a finger at the slop on the floor. "On your knees. I want to see you earn your paycheck." The entire cafeteria was now silent, watching. It was a standoff. The powerful, handsome director versus the old, silent janitor. Every eye was on Elias, waiting to see if he would break, if he would finally show the anger or shame Kalen so desperately wanted to see. For a long moment, Elias simply looked at Kalen. His gaze was unnerving. It wasn't the look of a subordinate. It was an appraisal. It was the look of a man who had assessed threats far greater than this, who had weighed options with far higher stakes. In that brief silence, he was not a janitor. He was something else entirely. Then the moment passed. The mask of the humble worker slid back into place. With a slow, deliberate movement that spoke of aching joints, but also of an iron will, Elias retrieved a cloth and a spray bottle from his cart. He knelt down, his bad knee protesting with a faint creak, and began to wipe up the salad. He didn't scrub frantically. He worked with the same methodical precision he always did, his movements efficient and neat. He was not cleaning up a mess. He was executing a task. As he worked, his back to the room, Kalen stood over him, basking in his perceived victory. "See?" he said to his table, though his voice was loud enough for the whole room to hear. "That's how you manage resources. You have to remind them of their place every now and then." No one laughed this time. The silence was thick with disapproval. Maya, unable to watch any longer, stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I'm sorry, Mr. Vance. I just remembered I have an urgent task," she mumbled, and fled the cafeteria, not looking back. Her small act of defiance went unnoticed by Kalen, who was too absorbed in his triumph. But Elias noticed. He heard her chair scrape, heard her hasty retreat. He paused his cleaning for just a fraction of a second. A small crack in the monolithic indifference of the world. He finished cleaning, the floor once again spotless. He rose to his feet, the movement slow and dignified. He didn't look at Kalen again. He simply packed his cloth away, pushed his cart, and continued on his rounds as if nothing had happened. He moved past the tables of silent, staring employees, his limp perhaps a little more pronounced than before. He had held his ground by yielding. He had won by refusing to fight. But as he walked away, the silver coin in his pocket felt colder than usual. Peace, he was learning, had a high price. And he was beginning to wonder if he could afford to keep paying it. The public humiliation was a turning point. For Kalen, It was a victory that solidified his power. For the employees of Cygnus Data, it was a shameful memory, a stark illustration of the cruelty their director was capable of. For Maya, it was a call to action, however small. She started leaving a sealed bottle of water or a packaged granola bar by the janitor's closet on the nights she worked late. She never saw him take it, but it was always gone by morning. It was a quiet, anonymous gesture of solidarity. For Elias, the incident was a stress test. He had endured. He had maintained his cover of anonymity. But the foundations were beginning to crack. The ghost was starting to feel the weight of his chains. Kalen, emboldened by Elias's passivity, escalated his campaign of torment. The attacks became more insidious, targeting not just Elias's dignity, but his competence and livelihood. He began documenting fictitious infractions. A security door supposedly left propped open on Elias's shift. A complaint about sensitive documents being moved on a desk he was cleaning. Each one was a fabrication, impossible for Elias to disprove. The second major escalation came 2 months after the cafeteria incident. It was more dangerous, more threatening, and it happened away from the public eye, which made it all the more chilling. Kalen summoned Elias to his office late one evening. When Elias arrived, he wasn't alone. A stern-faced man in a slightly too tight suit sat beside Kalen's desk. Elias recognized him as Mr. Peterson, the head of human resources, a man known for being Kalen's political enabler, a corporate hatchet man who protected the powerful. "Thorn, come in. Shut the door," Kalen commanded, gesturing to the single, uncomfortable chair opposite his sprawling mahogany desk. Elias entered, closing the door behind him. The click of the latch sounded unnaturally loud in the tense silence. He sat, his back straight, his hands resting on his knees. Kalen leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. He looked like a king passing judgment. "Mr. Peterson and I have been reviewing your employment file. It's thin. Very thin. You've been here, 5 years? And your previous employment history is just a string of similar custodial jobs in other cities. No real roots. A bit of a drifter, aren't you?" Elias remained silent. His file was thin by design. It was a carefully constructed fiction, a shell of a life just solid enough to pass a background check for a low-level service job, but intentionally devoid of any detail that could lead back to his real past. Peterson cleared his throat, picking up a folder from the desk. "Elias, we have a problem. There have been a series of minor security breaches over the last few weeks, all of them occurring during your shift hours. Most recently, the service closet on the sub-level 3, the one that contains the fiber optic switching for the entire building, was found unlocked. You were the last person signed in on that floor. The closet was locked when I finished my rounds," Elias stated calmly. "I check every door on my route. It's part of my process." "Your process seems to be failing," Kalen sneered. "This is a data security firm, Thorn. We can't have liabilities. A man with your limited background wandering around our most sensitive infrastructure is a risk I'm no longer willing to tolerate." The threat was clear. This wasn't about a door. It was about getting rid of him. Peterson chimed in, his voice oozing false concern. "What Mr. Vance is saying, Elias, is that we value security above all else. A single lapse could cost this company billions. We're putting you on formal probation. One more mark on your record, any mark, and it's grounds for immediate termination. For cause, which means, of course, no severance and no pension." The word pension was the knife. They knew he was older. They knew that for a man in his position, a pension was his only safety net for the future. They were threatening to cast him out with nothing. Elias looked from Peterson's insincere face to Kalen's triumphant smirk. He saw the trap. They would manufacture another incident within the week, and he would be gone. His carefully constructed sanctuary of anonymity was about to be demolished. For a moment, a flash of cold, hard fury sparked deep within him. It was an old, familiar feeling. The fury of a commander whose position was being overrun by incompetence and malice. He could end this, right now. A few well-chosen words, a single phone number spoken aloud. He could bring a world of hurt down on these two insignificant men. The power to dismantle their entire reality was sitting right there, behind his tired eyes. But he crushed the impulse. That would mean the end of his peace, the end of his quiet life. The ghost would be gone, and the colonel would be back, with all the ghosts that followed him. He wasn't ready. He didn't know if he ever would be, so he banked the fire, letting the mask of the weary janitor settle back over his features. "I understand," he said, the words costing him more than they could ever know. "Good," Kalen said, smiling. He stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. "Don't let us see you again, Thorn, unless it's on your way out the door for good." Elias stood, gave a stiff, almost imperceptible nod, and walked out of the office. As he closed the door, he heard Kalen laugh, a short, ugly bark of triumph. He walked down the silent corridor, his limp more pronounced than ever. He felt tired, a deep, soul-crushing exhaustion that had nothing to do with physical labor. He had survived ambushes, firefights, and political betrayals at the highest levels of government. But this war of 1,000 paper cuts, this slow, grinding erosion of his dignity, was a different kind of battle. As he passed the analytics department, he saw a light on in one of the cubicles. It was Maya. She was hunched over her keyboard, her face illuminated by the glow of her monitor. She looked up as he passed, her expression worried. She had clearly seen him being summoned to Kalen's office. Their eyes met for a moment across the darkened office. She gave him a small, hesitant smile of support. In her eyes, he didn't see pity. He saw respect. It was a small thing, a tiny gesture in a vast sea of indifference and hostility. But it was something. Elias gave a slight nod in return, a silent acknowledgement. He continued on his way, his hand in his pocket, his thumb tracing the outline of the eagle on his silver coin. The coin was a reminder of the oath he had taken, to a country, to a set of ideals. But tonight, it was also a reminder of the man he had been, a man of power and authority, a man who would not have tolerated this. He stopped in front of the large window at the end of the hall, looking out at the glittering expanse of the city. He had come here to disappear, to become a ghost. But he was discovering that even ghosts can be haunted. He was being backed into a corner, and Kalen Vance, in his arrogance, had no idea what happens when you corner something that has been pretending to be prey for far too long. The final week of Elias's probationary period was a tightrope walk over a canyon of anxiety. He performed his duties with an even more meticulous, almost monastic focus. He triple-checked every door. He documented his movements in a small, private logbook. He made himself smaller, more invisible than ever, hoping to simply run out the clock and survive. Kalen watched him like a hawk, a predator waiting for the slightest misstep. The tension in the building was a low-frequency hum that everyone could feel. The crisis, when it came, had nothing to do with Kalen's petty schemes. It was born in the cold, sterile heart of the building itself. The massive, state-of-the-art server farm on sub-level 5. It began with a flicker. The lights throughout the building blinked once, twice, then returned to normal. Most employees, engrossed in their work, barely noticed. But Elias, who was cleaning the glass walls of the main conference room, felt it. He felt the subtle shift in the building's rhythm, the change in the pitch of the ventilation system's hum. It was a discordant note in a familiar symphony. He stopped his work, his head cocked, listening. Then the alarm came. It wasn't a fire alarm. It was something far more terrifying for a company like Cygnus Data. It was a high-pitched, piercing electronic shriek that echoed from the lower levels, accompanied by the sudden, sickening flashing of red emergency lights. A voice, calm and computerized, echoed from the intercoms. Alert! Thermal variance detected in primary server hub. All non-essential personnel evacuate lower levels. This is a code red data integrity event. Panic erupted. Employees began to stream out of their offices, their faces a mixture of confusion and fear. This wasn't a drill. Kalen Vance burst out of his office, his face flushed with a mixture of alarm and opportunity. A crisis was a stage, and he was its leading man. "All right, everyone, stay calm," he shouted, his voice projecting authority. "I'm heading down to operations. Engineering team with me, now." He strode toward the secure elevators that led to the sub-levels, his team of shell-shocked engineers scrambling to follow. As he passed Elias, who was standing still amidst the chaos, he didn't even spare him a glance. "You," he barked at a nearby security guard. "Keep the civilians clear, and make sure he—" Kalen jerked a thumb toward Elias. "Stays up here. The last thing we need is some janitor getting underfoot." The guard nodded, moving to block the hallway. Elias watched Kalen and his team disappear into the elevator, a knot of cold dread tightening in his stomach. He knew what a thermal variance alarm meant. He also knew Kalen Vance. The man was a manager of people, not a master of systems. His expertise was in spreadsheets and intimidation, not in the delicate, complex dance of thermodynamics and power distribution that kept a server farm from melting down. Elias walked over to a nearby workstation that an employee had abandoned in their haste. The screen showed a real-time diagnostic feed of the building's core systems. He didn't need a password. The emergency broadcast had overridden the lock screens. The data scrolling by confirmed his worst fears. It wasn't just a simple overheating issue. The primary and secondary cooling systems were reporting conflicting data. Flow rates were fluctuating wildly. Core temperatures in server rack 7A, the heart of their entire cloud infrastructure, were climbing at an exponential rate. He saw the pattern immediately. It was a classic cascade failure, triggered by a faulty sensor creating a deadly feedback loop. The system thought the core was cooling, so it reduced coolant flow, which made the core heat up faster, which made the faulty sensor report an even lower temperature. It was a snake eating its own tail, and the end result would be a multi-million-dollar room of servers turning into a solid block of molten slag. All of their clients' data, financial records, medical histories, proprietary corporate secrets would be vaporized. Cygnus Data would cease to exist in a matter of minutes. Down in the server hub, Kalen was in over his head and sinking fast. The room was an inferno of noise and heat. Technicians were shouting conflicting reports. Core temp at 150 degrees Celsius and climbing. "I can't get the primary coolant pumps to respond. The manual override is locked out." Kalen stood before the main console, his face pale, sweat plastering his expensive shirt to his back. His confidence was a shattered facade. He was barking orders based on the emergency manual, a playbook for a game he didn't understand. "Flood the system with emergency coolant," he commanded. "Sir, that will trip the pressure sensors and cause a full system shutdown." His lead engineer protested. "We'll lose everything anyway." "I am the director here," Kalen screamed, his voice cracking with panic. "Do as I say." Upstairs, Elias watched the corresponding data stream on the monitor. He saw Kalen's command being entered. He saw the pressure levels in the system begin to spike dangerously. They were making it worse. They were accelerating the disaster. He couldn't just stand here. This went beyond Kalen, beyond his job, beyond his desire for anonymity. This was about catastrophic failure, and he was the only one in the building who knew how to stop it. The infrastructure of Cygnus data he had discovered during his quiet, nightly rounds was a simplified, less stable commercial version of a network he himself had designed a decade ago for the Department of Defense. Project Chimera, his masterpiece. He knew its every strength and every weakness. He knew exactly which fuse to pull, which line of code to rewrite. He turned from the monitor and started walking toward the secure elevator. The guard Kalen had posted moved to block him. "Sorry, Elias, you can't go down there. Mr. Vance's orders." Elias didn't slow down. He looked the guard, a young man named Ben, directly in the eye. His voice was no longer the quiet murmur of a janitor. It was low, resonant, and filled with an absolute, unshakable authority. "Ben, in approximately 2 minutes, the servers downstairs are going to superheat and the halon fire suppression system will dump. The reaction will create a phosgene gas cloud. This entire level will become a kill box. You have a wife and a new baby. Get everyone off this floor and seal the stairwells. That is not a request." Ben stared, mesmerized and terrified. He was looking at Elias Thorne, the janitor, but he was hearing a commander. The certainty in Elias's voice was more compelling than any corporate title. Ben swallowed hard and nodded, fumbling for his radio. "All units, code black. Evacuate floor 30. Seal all stairwell access. Now, now, now." As the guards scrambled to obey this new, terrifying command, Elias reached the elevator. It was locked, requiring executive-level clearance. He didn't hesitate. He reached into his pocket and pulled out not his coin, but his janitorial ring of keys. He ignored the high-tech card scanner and knelt down, inserting a simple, old-fashioned J key into the manual override lock at the base of the panel. A tool for maintenance access. A tool no one but the custodial staff even knew existed. He gave it a sharp turn. With a heavy clunk, the electronic lock disengaged. The doors slid open. Elias stepped inside and pressed the button for sub-level 5. The doors closed, and the elevator began its descent into the heart of the crisis. The ghost was gone. Colonel Elias Thorne was back on duty. The elevator doors opened onto a scene of pure, unadulterated chaos. The heat hit Elias like a physical blow, a dry baking wave that smelled of burning plastic and ozone. The shrieking of the alarms was a physical pain. Technicians were running, shouting, their faces slick with sweat and panic. In the center of it all, stood Kalen Vance, frozen before the main console, his knuckles white where he gripped the edge. His eyes were wide with the horrified realization that he was utterly, hopelessly lost. He had crashed the ship into the iceberg, and now he could only stand and watch it sink. Elias strode out of the elevator, his limp barely noticeable, his body moving with a purpose that cut through the surrounding panic like a knife. The technicians, seeing him, faltered. A janitor? Here? Now? But there was something in his eyes, a laser-like focus and an absolute lack of fear. that made them instinctively step aside. He reached the central command console, brushing past a stunned Kalen without a word. His eyes devoured the screen, his mind processing the torrent of error codes in milliseconds. He saw the fatal command Kalen had entered. He saw the pressure climbing toward the red line. He had seconds. "Get me admin access. Now," Elias said, his voice a low command. He didn't look at Kalen. He was speaking to the lead engineer, a man named David, who was staring at him, dumbfounded. I can't. Who are you?" David stammered. Elias's head snapped around, his eyes locking onto David's. The weary, placid janitor was gone. In his place was a man who radiated an intensity that was terrifying. "My name is not important. What is important is that in 20 seconds, the primary coolant manifold is going to rupture. When it does, this room will be flash-flooded with superheated steam. You have 5 seconds to give me access, or you and everyone in this room will be boiled alive. Your choice." The raw, brutal certainty of the threat galvanized David. He fumbled at the keyboard, his fingers shaking, and typed in his master override code. It's open." Elias pushed him aside. His hands, gnarled and calloused from years of manual labor, flew across the keyboard with a speed and precision that was mesmerizing. He wasn't hunting and pecking. He was a virtuoso. Lines of code appeared on the screen, a language no one else in the room understood. He wasn't following a manual. He was writing a new one. "Kill the primary pumps," he commanded, his eyes still on the screen. "Now, manually sever the connection. I don't care how. Rip the wires out if you have to." 2 technicians, jolted out of their stupor, ran to obey. Kalen finally found his voice. It was a thin, reedy screech of pure indignation. "What are you doing? I am in command here. You are fired. Security, arrest this man." No one moved. All eyes were on Elias. On the impossible ballet, his fingers were dancing on the keyboard. He was in a world of his own, a zone of pure, focused competence. "I've bypassed the faulty sensor," Elias muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Rerouting the auxiliary coolant feed through the secondary heat exchangers. It's a closed loop. It won't hold for long, but it will hold. He looked up from the screen, his gaze sweeping the room. "You," he said, pointing to a young technician. "Get me a direct hard line to the substation power grid. I need to manually cycle the breakers to prevent a brownout surge. You," he pointed to another, "monitor the core temperature. Call it out to me every 5 seconds." The orders were sharp, precise, and utterly confident. The panicked technicians, leaderless and terrified moments before, now had a commander. They moved to obey without question. This man, whoever he was, knew what he was doing. He was their only hope. "Core temp is 170 and holding," the technician called out. "It's not dropping," David said, his voice laced with renewed panic. "It will," Elias said calmly. "The auxiliary system is smaller. It needs time to absorb the thermal load." He turned to Kalen, his eyes cold. You've done enough. Go stand in a corner and try not to break anything else." The sheer, contemptuous dismissal of the order, delivered in a flat, emotionless tone, struck Kalen harder than a physical blow. In front of his own staff, he had been reduced to a disobedient child. His face went from pale to a blotchy, furious red. But before he could retort, the technician shouted again, 169, it's dropping. Core temp is 168. A ragged cheer went through the room. The temperature was falling. The alarms, one by one, began to silence themselves as the systems returned to nominal parameters. The high-pitched shriek was replaced by the steady, reassuring hum of a system operating as it should. In the space of 3 minutes, Elias Thorne had single-handedly pulled Cygnus data back from the brink of absolute annihilation. He stood before the console, his shoulders slumping slightly, the immense wave of adrenaline beginning to recede. He let out a slow, controlled breath. The silence that followed was broken by Kalen Vance. His rage, having been momentarily silenced by the successful intervention, now returned with the force of a tidal wave. This janitor hadn't just disobeyed him. He had succeeded where he had failed. He had saved the day, and in doing so, had exposed Kalen's incompetence to everyone. The humiliation was absolute, and it was unbearable. "Get him!" Kalen hissed, his voice trembling with fury. He pointed a shaking finger at Elias. "Get him out of here. I want him arrested. I want him charged. Corporate espionage, trespassing, willful destruction of company property. I'll see him in prison for the rest of his miserable life." This time, the 2 security guards, who had been hovering uselessly near the door, started forward. They had their orders, and the immediate crisis was over. They grabbed Elias by the arms, their grips firm. Elias didn't resist. He looked utterly exhausted, the fire in his eyes banked once more, replaced by that familiar, bone-deep weariness. He had done what he had to do. He had broken his cover, violated the terms of his self-imposed exile. He knew there would be consequences. He had saved the company, but he had likely damned himself. As the guards began to march him toward the elevator, a new sound cut through the room. A sharp, authoritative chime from the very elevator Elias had arrived in. The doors slid open, and everything changed. Through the doors strode the imposing figure of General Marcus Madsen, flanked by his silent, black-clad tactical team. The general's eyes, the color of cold steel, swept the room, taking in the scene in an instant. The relieved but bewildered technicians, the furious, sputtering Kalen Vance, and the 2 security guards holding a man in a janitor's uniform. Madsen's gaze locked onto Elias. The hard lines of his face softened for a fraction of a second, replaced by a look of immense, profound relief. He ignored Kalen completely, striding across the server room with a purpose that commanded absolute attention. The security guards holding Elias faltered, their steps slowing as this new, overwhelming power entered the room. "Let him go," Madsen said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the unquestionable weight of command. It was the kind of voice that did not brook argument. The guards instantly released Elias's arms as if they had been burned. They stepped back, their faces a mixture of fear and confusion. Kalen, seeing his authority challenged yet again, puffed up his chest. "I am the director of operations here, and I have no idea who you are, but this man is under arrest for... You are the temporary custodian of a piece of hardware you clearly do not understand." Madsen cut him off, his voice like ice. He didn't even look at Kalen as he spoke. His entire focus was on Elias. "Are you all right, Colonel?" The word hung in the air, a grenade with the pin pulled. "Colonel." The entire room went dead silent. The technicians, the security guards, even Kalen, everyone froze. They looked at the old janitor in his sweat-stained gray uniform, and then at the 4-star general who had just called him Colonel. The 2 words did not compute. It was like trying to solve an equation where 2 + 2 equaled a battleship. Elias straightened up, a subtle shift in his posture. The weary slump was gone, replaced by a ramrod-straight spine. The janitor vanished, and for the first time in 5 years, Colonel Elias Thorne stood at his full, albeit weary, height. "I'm operational, General," Elias said, his voice quiet, but with a new timbre. The voice of a peer. The situation is contained. Minimal hardware damage, no data loss. But the core architecture is compromised. It's a bad copy, Marcus. Unstable. I know, Madsen said, his expression grim. He finally turned his gaze on Kalen, and it was with a look of such utter contempt that Kalen physically flinched. Mr. Vance, my name is General Marcus Madsen, United States Cyber Command. We are here at the request of the Department of Defense to take control of this facility. Kalen's face went white. Cyber Command? This is a private corporation. You have no jurisdiction here. You are operating a network that is a derivative of a classified military program, Project Chimera, Madsen stated flatly. You are doing so without authorization, and your gross incompetence nearly triggered a national security crisis. Believe me, Mr. Vance, we have jurisdiction. Madsen's aide, a young major, stepped forward and handed Kalen a thick file folder stamped with warnings in red ink. That is the warrant. And this, Madsen continued, taking a slim, leather-bound portfolio from the same aide, is a personnel file you should have paid more attention to. Madsen didn't give the file to Kalen. Instead, he opened it and turned to face the assembled employees of Cygnus Data, who were all watching, wide-eyed and silent. You all know this man as Elias Thorne, your janitor, Madsen began, his voice ringing with authority. You have seen him mop your floors. You have seen him empty your trash. Some of you have treated him with kindness, and some of you, his eyes flicked momentarily to Kalen, have treated him with contempt. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Let me tell you who you have been ordering to clean up your spilled coffee. Madsen looked down at the file. His real name is Colonel Elias Thorne, United States Air Force. Retired. His last active posting was as the Director of Special Projects at DARPA. He is the chief architect of the global secure strategic data network that protects this nation's most vital intelligence. Codename, Chimera. He holds a PhD in network theory from MIT and a master's in cryptology from Caltech. He is the recipient of the Defense Distinguished Service Medal, the Silver Star, and a Presidential Medal of Freedom for actions undertaken during the Al-Qaim cyber incursion, where he single-handedly prevented the theft of our entire Middle East command and control structure, saving the lives of thousands of service members. With every credential Madsen listed, another layer of Kalen Vance's reality peeled away. His face had gone from red to white to a pasty, sickly gray. His mouth hung open, a silent O of disbelief. He stared at Elias, at the old man he had tormented, the fossil he had tried to have fired, and saw a titan. Maya, who had defied the evacuation order and was watching from the doorway, felt tears spring to her eyes. It wasn't just vindication. It was awe. The quiet, kind man, who she had shared knowing glances with, was a hero, a legend. Madsen closed the file with a soft snap. Colonel Thorne chose a life of anonymity after a great personal tragedy. He asked for nothing but peace. He came here to be invisible, and you, Mr. Vance, in your infinite arrogance, couldn't even grant him that. Madsen turned to face Elias directly. The general, one of the most powerful men in the United States military, drew himself up to his full height. His tactical team, as one, mirrored the movement. Then, in the dead silence of the multi-million-dollar server room, General Marcus Madsen raised his hand to his brow in a sharp, perfect salute. Colonel Thorne, he said, his voice thick with emotion and a decade of shared history. It is an honor, sir. On behalf of a grateful nation, we thank you for your service. Again. The three black-clad operatives snapped to attention and rendered their own salutes. 4 men, the embodiment of American military power, saluting a janitor in a dirty uniform. The sight was so powerful, so emotionally overwhelming, that a few of the technicians, former service members themselves, instinctively straightened up, their faces etched with awe and respect. Elias looked at Madsen, at the men saluting him. A lifetime of discipline, of holding his emotions in a steel-caged box, threatened to crumble. He saw not just a general, but his friend, his protege from decades ago. He saw the recognition he had never sought, but which now washed over him like a cleansing fire. He returned the salute, his own movement just as crisp, a piece of muscle memory from a life he thought he had buried forever. "At ease, Marcus," he said, his voice raspy. As they lowered their hands, the spell was broken. The full, crushing weight of the revelation landed on Kalen Vance. He had not just bullied a janitor, he had humiliated a decorated war hero, a man who held the nation's highest honors, a living legend in the world of cybersecurity. And he had done it publicly, repeatedly. His career wasn't just over. His life as he knew it was over. The silence was his executioner's song. Kalen Vance, for the first time in his privileged life, was truly and utterly terrified. His mind, scrambling for a lifeline, latched onto the only thing it had ever known: influence. "My father," he began, his voice a desperate, cracking whisper. "My father is Alistair Vance. He's one of your biggest defense contractors. He sits on the board of—" "We know who your father is," General Madsen interrupted, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet level. "And he is about to have a very, very bad day." He nodded to one of his tactical officers. "Captain." The captain stepped forward. He wasn't a corporate security guard. His eyes were cold, professional, and utterly devoid of sympathy. "Kalen Vance," he said, his voice flat and official. "You are under arrest." "Arrest?" Kalen shrieked, his composure shattering completely. "For what? For what? This is insane." "For conspiracy to commit espionage against the United States, for willful violation of the National Security Act, and for criminal negligence resulting in a direct threat to critical defense infrastructure," the captain recited, as he pulled out a pair of military-grade zip-tie cuffs. "Your father's company, Vance Strategic, illegally acquired a beta version of the Chimera source code 6 years ago. They built this entire company, Cygnus Data, on stolen, classified government property. We've been watching you for years, waiting for you to make a mistake big enough to act on." Madsen gestured around the now stable server room. "Tonight, thanks to your spectacular incompetence, you gave us everything we needed. You not only proved you were using our tech, you proved you were incapable of managing it, and in doing so, nearly exposed its core vulnerabilities to the world." The blood drained completely from Kalen's face. It wasn't just his job, it was his father, his family's entire empire. It was all built on a lie, and that lie had just come crashing down. "No," he whispered, shaking his head in denial. "No, you can't." The captain and another operative grabbed Kalen's arms, forcing them behind his back with practiced, painful efficiency. Kalen struggled for a moment, a pathetic, futile thrashing against the inevitable. "You have the right to remain silent." The captain began to drone, the words of the Miranda warning sounding like a death sentence in the sterile room. As they cuffed him, Kalen's wild eyes found Elias. His face, once so handsome and arrogant, was now a twisted mask of desperation and hate. "You," he snarled, his voice a venomous rasp. "You did this. You planned this all along, didn't you, you old bastard?" Elias met his gaze. The weariness was still there, but now it was overlaid with a profound, sorrowful pity. "No, Mr. Vance," he said, his voice calm and even. "I planned nothing. I just wanted to be left alone. You did this to yourself. You were so busy looking down on everyone, you never thought to look up." The truth of those words, the simple, devastating finality of them, broke Kalen. A sob, a raw, ugly sound of a spoiled child having his favorite toy taken away, escaped his lips. He sagged in the operative's grip, all the fight gone out of him. They began to march him toward the elevator, his expensive shoes scuffing on the floor he had once forced another man to kneel upon. As he was led away, a spattering of applause broke out among the technicians. It started with one, then another, then the whole room. It was a spontaneous, heartfelt tribute not just to the hero who had saved them, but to the quiet, dignified man they had watched endure so much abuse. Elias looked uncomfortable with the attention, but General Madsen put a hand on his shoulder. "Let them," he said quietly. "They're not just clapping for the colonel. They're clapping for Elias, the man who cared enough to stay." Maya pushed her way through the crowd, her face streaked with tears, but her eyes shining. She stopped in front of Elias, suddenly shy. "Colonel, sir, thank you. Not just for this," she gestured around the room, "but for everything. For being kind." Elias gave her a small, genuine smile. It was the first time that anyone in the building had ever seen him smile, and it transformed his tired face. "The pleasure was all mine, Maya. Kindness is never a small thing." The reckoning was swift and merciless. Kalen Vance was not just fired, he was erased. Federal agents sealed his office, and his name was scrubbed from the company directory before his transport had even left the building's underground garage. The news of his arrest and the true nature of Cygnus Data's origins sent shockwaves through the tech and financial industries. Vance's strategic stock plummeted into oblivion overnight. Alistair Vance, the titan of industry, was indicted a week later, his empire crumbling into dust, a monument to his own greed and his son's arrogance. The cascading consequences were total. Peterson, the sycophantic HR manager, was fired immediately for his role in enabling Kalen's behavior and for his complicity in the fraudulent hiring and personnel practices. He was last seen carrying a cardboard box out of the building, avoiding the eyes of the same employees he used to terrorize. The board of directors was purged, and Cygnus Data was effectively nationalized, placed under the temporary stewardship of a joint DoD and private sector task force. And at the head of that task force, in a role he had neither wanted nor sought, was Colonel Elias Thorne. 6 months later, the Cygnus Data Tower was a different place. The oppressive atmosphere of fear had been replaced by a quiet, focused hum of genuine innovation. The company had been restructured, its mission statement rewritten. It was now a leader in ethical data security, working in public-private partnership with the government Elias had once served. Elias had an office now. A large corner office, ironically, the very one Kalen Vance had once occupied. But the space was transformed. The ostentatious mahogany desk was gone, replaced by a simple, functional steel and birch workstation. The walls weren't covered in abstract art, but in whiteboards filled with complex algorithms and network diagrams. He rarely wore a suit, preferring a simple button-down shirt and comfortable slacks. He was still Elias, just visible now. He wasn't a manager in the way Kalen had been. He didn't dictate, he taught. He didn't command, he inspired. The brightest young minds in the company now flocked to him, not out of fear, but out of a deep and abiding respect for his knowledge and his character. Maya was his new head of R&D. He had seen the spark of brilliance in her, buried under layers of insecurity that Kalen had fostered. Under Elias's mentorship, she thrived. Her potential unleashed, she now walked the halls with a confidence that was born of competence, not arrogance. One afternoon, Maya knocked on his open office door. "Elias, General Madsen is on the secure line for you." "Thank you, Maya." "Patch him through," Elias said, leaning back in his chair. He looked out the window at the sprawling city below. It was a view he had once cleaned from the outside, looking in. Now, he saw it from a different perspective. "Elias, you old ghost." Madsen's voice boomed over the speakerphone, warm and familiar. "Still haven't learned how to take a vacation, I see." "Someone has to keep the lights on, Marcus," Elias replied, a hint of humor in his tone. "What can I do for you?" "Just a courtesy call. The Vance sentencing came down today. I thought you'd want to know." Elias fell silent for a moment. He hadn't thought about Kalen Vance in months. "How bad?" 25 years, federal prison, no parole. His father got 40. They threw the book at them. It's over, Elias. Truly over." "Good," Elias said softly. It wasn't a word of triumph. It was a word of closure. A final, quiet period at the end of a long and painful sentence. The epilogue to Kalen's story was written in the drab gray of a federal penitentiary. Stripped of his tailored suits, his expensive watches, and his father's influence, he was just another inmate. He had been a predator in the corporate jungle, but in this new, brutal ecosystem, he was prey. His arrogance, once his shield, was now a target. He was a ghost in a different kind of machine, invisible not because he was overlooked, but because he was worthless. His days were spent in the prison laundry, the hot, steamy air a constant reminder of the server room where his life had unraveled. He was no longer a director, a prince, a man of importance. He was just a number, haunted by the memory of a janitor's quiet, judging eyes. The karma was not just poetic, it was absolute. After his call with Madsen, Elias stood and walked over to the window. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the silver coin. He had taken it to a jeweler a few weeks ago. The tarnish was gone, polished away to reveal the brilliant, intricate detail of the eagle and the shield beneath. It shone in the fading light. It was no longer an anchor to a painful past, a defense against a hostile present. Now, it was just a reminder of who he was in all his complexities. Colonel, janitor, director, mentor. He was all of them. He had finally integrated the two halves of his life. He was no longer hiding. He was home. Maya appeared at his door again, holding 2 mugs of coffee. "Thought you could use this," she said, handing one to him. "Thank you," he said, taking the mug. They stood together in silence for a moment, watching the city lights begin to twinkle to life. "You know," Maya said quietly, "for a long time, I thought this was the worst place I'd ever worked. But now I wouldn't want to be anywhere else." Elias looked at the brilliant young woman beside him, at the thriving, ethical company he was building, at the peace he had finally found, not in anonymity, but in purpose. He took a sip of his coffee and allowed himself a small, contented smile. "Me neither, Maya," he said. "Me neither." The ghost of Cygnus Data was finally at rest, not by disappearing, but by choosing to be seen.